Marites Vitug, and this is Worldview. We look at global, regional, and national affairs in conversations with officials, newsmakers, and analysts. Joining us is Matteo Piasentini, a senior lecturer at the UP Political Science Department. He's also an analyst of the Indo-Pacific desk at Geopolitica, an Italian think tank. We will discuss Europe's strategic interest in the Philippines and the various defense agreements some European countries have forged with the Philippines. Matteo, welcome to the show. Thank you for making time.
Good morning, Marites. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So let's start first with Europe's strategic interest in the Philippines. I think this is a relatively new phenomenon, the Philippines as part of the Indo-Pacific. What drives Europe's strategic interest here?
First, let's define Europe. There are several levels, right? So the first level, of course, is the single European states interest. Then we have a European Union interest that is Europeanized or expanded or harmonized depending on different degrees of integration and coordination. Then, of course, we can also think of a G7 NATO coordination that drives security interests in the Indo-Pacific. Let's start with the broader context. There is an increased sense in Europe that the European security scenario, security issues are connected with Indo-Pacific security issues. That's first. Second, we have an increased sense that the current rules-based international order, that is the pillar of European foreign policies at all levels, so state level, European level, EU level, and so on, is being increasingly challenged. And then, of course, there are other value-laden considerations about the promotion of democratic values, liberal values that are essential for our constitutional systems. And I would say, last but not the least, a significant economic and geo-economic interest. So, of course, this is the complexity of the levels of interest that overlap. So there is an institutional overlap, and there's also like a domain overlap among all of these countries. But I would say that, again, broadly speaking, security has increasingly become actually the driver for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. It justifies, in a way, even the existence of Indo-Pacific as an operational concept or a geopolitical construct that has been, in a way or another, accepted by European states.
So is China's assertiveness, I mean, not just in Europe, but here in the Indo-Pacific, driving this also, this strategic interest in the Philippines?
Well, when it comes to the Philippines, and specifically the Philippines, and let's say the challenge of the Philippines in upholding its sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea, which is part of the South China Sea, we can see that the initial, at least, approach or interest that drives European states is actually the challenges that we're seeing in the West Philippine Sea. And there are arguably three reasons for that. So the first, of course, is the most relevant in the sense that European states and Europe thrives in a free and open ocean. In a regime of freedom of the seas that has been negotiated back in 1982 and arguably has allowed these European states to trade with the world and to expand their connections. And I mean, I can talk about Italy and Germany, for example. They are manufacturing powerhouses, and they deeply depend on the global trade, which passes through, of course, sea lines of communications, etc. So the regime is very convenient for these states. And having foreign powers that directly, indirectly, explicitly, non-explicitly challenge this regime is a big source of concern. So that's, of course, the first interest, right, when it comes to Chinese assertive behavior in the South China Sea. What European states want to prevent is a separate regime in the South China Sea, because that would, like we see the disruption that, closure of seas cause to the global economy, right? And we're just talking about an energy crisis when it comes to hormones. But the South China Sea controlled by one power would mean a scenario that European states want to avoid. And so that's the first, I would say, interest in upholding the rule of law, and that's why there is a commonality of normative alignment or like-mindedness with the Philippines in this sense. But there are other concerns. The second one is actually the idea that it has become a red zone, right? A hot spot, as we call it, right? Because of the violence that we're seeing in the sea, number one. And number two is the fact that being the Philippines a treaty ally of the United States, in theory, right, the idea that a conflict can arise and beyond any possible control, right, is there. So, and this is also connected with something that we've seen during especially the Biden administration, which is the idea that the United States were directly or, again, indirectly coordinating, orchestrating, or demanding European states for a greater involvement in the Indo-Pacific. That there are talks about integrated deterrence. So it's not just the Philippines, of course. It's part of a broader coordination strategy that actually requires greater involvement even by European states, especially just to mention, we are talking about states that have very relevant naval capabilities. I mean, France and the UK are nuclear powers. Italy in itself has aircraft carriers. So in theory, even if their involvement was never historically or like in recent history that big in this area of the world, it still means that on paper, these countries have the capabilities to do so. And, this has consequences when it comes to signaling, building confidence, and even reassuring states that are under pressure, like the Philippines, right? The third interest when it comes to the Philippines that has been manifested in some declarations by these states is also that the Philippines is a democratic country. And this is quite relevant for European states for the reasons we illustrated before, right? Democratic states tend, not always, of course, but tend to uphold the rules-based international order.
So how about there are some people saying that, yeah, Europe is interested because they want a market for their defense equipment, so many manufacturing companies in Europe. Mm-hmm. This is one of the reasons also, right?
Yes, it is one of the reasons, but I would refrain from explaining everything through this agency of the military-industrial complex or something like that. Now, maybe this is a bit technical, but it's important to sort of like have an idea on how these industries operate in the European context. So most European states, or let's say the relevant ones when it comes to defense industry, so Italy, well, of course, the UK, France, Germany, Sweden, limited part, or inconspicuous part, it is most of these defense companies are deeply involved with the state. So many are state-owned enterprises, or anyway, they thrive by providing supplies, military equipment to their armed forces, their respective armed forces. So yes, it is what we call the military-industrial complex on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a driver for research, development, innovation, economic advancement, because and for these countries, right, their armed forces cannot absorb all of the production that these companies make. So they need to export. It's not like the United States that is always the ultimate buyer of their defense companies. So a potential market like the Philippines that has announced the Horizon 3, Re-Horizon, we call it.
The modernization of the military?
Exactly. It is a market that has to be explored by these countries. But there are positive spillovers in approaching the Philippines through arms sales, because if one of the interests of the Philippines, right, is to become more interoperable with foreign armed forces, well, in that sense, having equipments that are tested already by capable militaries of European states can also allow for military know-how transfers, number one. And number two, there is a sense by European states, and it has been communicated by the Philippines, that these are not just simply sales, but the Philippines would have a preference to embed these sales into like some sort of defense production systems, right? And I think it encounters the idea that European states wants a sustained deeper presence in the Philippines on the one hand, and the Philippines wants tech transfers and, let's say, kickstart some spark of industrial development in this sense. So it goes hand in hand.
So let's talk first about France, because it's the first European country to sign a visiting forces agreement or a status of visiting forces agreement with the Philippines. And this is historic. I mean, we've never had this kind of arrangement with any European country. So how does this benefit, well, maybe France and then the Philippines?
So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, France is a UN Security Council permanent member. They have nuclear weapons. They have relevant naval capabilities. They have a very sizable army. And military capabilities in general, and they retain a very big amount of overseas territories, including overseas territories here in the Indo-Pacific, right? And also, just to mention incidentally, they have the biggest exclusive economic zone in the world. If you compile, right, all of the exclusive economic zone projected by those overseas territories. They are also the first European states or one of the first, don't remember if Germany comes first or them, to issue their own Indo-Pacific vision strategy. And it is explicitly mentioned there that they have a territorial maritime security component, for starters. Second, they want to forge sovereignty partnerships with like-minded states that have a common interest, which is, the defense of what is entitled to them by UNCLOS. But more importantly, a French military presence in the Philippines is directly impacting their Indo-Pacific strategy, because they will learn from, the practice of maritime patrols, exercises. Now they have participated in years back as observators
of the shoulder to Balikatan.
Yeah, of the Balikatan. But participating actively gives their military know-how of archipelagic defense, some practices in the kind of territory that the Philippines has, and so on and so on. So there's a direct, important benefit for the French troops there. And, for the Philippines, of course, is that including, embedding, inviting more partners help the Philippines in, number one, building interoperability. Number two, actually signaling to potential adversaries that there is a closer, deeper relation with a nuclear power, for example, right? With naval capabilities in that sense. And third, of course, connected to what we discussed earlier, right? There is also a sense of perhaps a cost of setting policy, in the sense that French troops in the Philippine territory conducting military activities and so on, they pursue military objectives that have a positive impact in Philippine security that the Philippines doesn't have to pay for, right? And of course, all of this combines, on the other hand helps building confidence, therefore facilitates technology transfers, arm trades, and so on and so on. So it goes hand in hand.
It's interesting that you said that it signals that the Philippines has close relations or deepening relations with a nuclear power. I mean, this is timely because President Marcos is going to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin on... We're recording this interview on June 16, and I think the meeting will be on June 17 or 18 in Russia, on the sidelines of the ASEAN-Russia dialogue. So it's Yeah, well, I mean, it's fascinating about foreign policy is also the optics of it. And after France, UK is the second European country to negotiate a VFA also with the Philippines. And UK is, as you said earlier, is another nuclear power of Europe. So is there interest in the Philippines similar to that of France?
I would say that as far as the UK is concerned, there is a similar interest, and actually the UK, because of Brexit, right? They do have a vision of a global Britain that, you know, depending on the government, of course, has been shifted, changed, and turns. But the idea is that perhaps this more in terms of vision, right? They always had aspirations of global projection and actually a staunch concern on global security. Like what I try to emphasize is that these states, especially France and the UK, are global actors, not regional actors alone, right? And so their capabilities can be put at the service of global security. Of course, the United Kingdom has a deeper and probably the deepest involvement among European states with this part of the world. I would just like to mention, incidentally, they are historically part of, let's say, grouping of security that is called the five-power defense arrangement with other Southeast Asian countries and Australia. They have historical ties, security ties with Australia and New Zealand, for example, and they are part of the AUKUS trilateral, right? And AUKUS involves the provision, right, of nuclear technology to Australia for civilian purposes, just propelling the submarines. But the idea is that through these arrangements, the UK is further and further enmeshed in Indo-Pacific security. They are also the ones that actually talk more openly about integrated deterrence. So a tighter coordination with other allies like the United States, Canada, other allies of the what we call the Anglosphere, right? That's the thing. So to me, it feels in a way natural that the UK follows that steps because it's part of a structured regional engagement that is even more historically rooted than other powers.
A relatively new European country that has forged defense cooperation with the Philippines is Germany. Germany and the Philippines signed their first ever defense cooperation agreement last year. And as we speak, again, we're recording this on June 16, the German president is in town on a state visit, and among the subjects he'll be talking about with the president is security cooperation. So maybe you can give us a bit of a glimpse on Germany, and why. Well, it's not like the UK and France, but why are they interested as well?
So I skimmed through months ago their guidelines for the Indo-Pacific issued by Germany even before the European Union actually issued them. So it's France, Germany, and the Netherlands that actually were very active at the EU level for that. So what differs in the German approach is that, of course, they are more conscious of the fact that they have less power projection. But not that much. I mean, they still have relevant capabilities. However, the German approach, also for obvious historical reasons, has always been more tied to multilateralism and democracy promotion and, let's say, positive cooperation in that sense. And this tone is actually visible in their guidelines. Now, however, this doesn't mean that the Germans are naive. They know that security and values go hand in hand. Like, I mean, we are experiencing that on a daily basis in Europe for what is happening in Ukraine, right? So in a way, the fact that Germany has a softer approach than other states does not mean that their involvement is not significant. And what I see happening is that there is defense approachment, but the Germans are trying to find a niche that doesn't involve necessarily like probably strong deployments in that sense. Because this is my opinion only, they're probably still evaluating the extent of these involvement. But this doesn't mean that, for example, the Philippines is mentioned as a key democratic partner for Germany, even in 2020. And I remember that Philippines was, in a way, backsliding more towards illiberalism in that sense. But Germany understood and recognized the democratic values and traditions of the Philippines. So I think that there is cooperation deepening in that sense, having in mind some specificities of Germany and some constraints. You can also imagine that Germany is not keen for strategic cultural reasons to power projection activities for obvious historical concerns. But nonetheless, and I think I want to connect to what you said about the visit of their president, right? So it's not the head of the executive, it's the president of the Federal Republic of Germany. So it has more of a symbolic whole of the nation value. But the fact that he took the leap and actually went to the Philippines, it signals that there is a long-term, probably deeper alignment that the German state has the intention of sustaining, regardless of the party coalitions.
It's interesting because, according to reports, this is the first visit of a German president in 60 years.
Yeah.
So that's why we're all suddenly looking at, not suddenly, but gradually looking at Europe as well as a security partner. Now let's talk about your country and why Italy and the Philippines signed a defense cooperation agreement, although I understand we already had an old one, which was sort of inactive.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through this?
Yeah, so defense cooperation agreements are executive agreements that, of course, activities can be conducted under the cap of these agreements, but also they don't really contain binding obligations to, they facilitate cooperation, let's say. But in terms of mutual will, right, there is a degree of flexibility, I would say. Now, this is also connected to the fact that the previous agreement that, if my memory assists me, was signed in 2004, and then it was updated in 2014, I believe, was actually reverting more on logistics. And in a way, it was a framework that reflects the interest at the time, which was, well, the world is safer, so we're just going to facilitate some logistics, and perhaps this will lead to military exports, and so on and so on. And also, it is a sign of diplomatic goodwill. It is a token for how to say, like, military diplomacy, so it facilitates or justifies mutual visits, and so on and so on. Now, the new agreement, of course, deepens cooperation. For what is my understanding, it is the result of what we call Italy's quiet approach to the Indo-Pacific. Right now in Italy, there is, let's say, a debate on the extent of our involvement in the Indo-Pacific, which means that there will be probably an involvement in the Indo-Pacific, but we don't know how many resources to allocate to it. So that's why we see our steps being a bit more cautious. Just to mention, incidentally, Italy is very involved with foreign military missions, so we deploy personnel abroad, and we cover an area that is, of course, mostly around, our immediate neighborhood. So Northern Africa, the Middle East, we have security challenges there. I mean, I think it's under everybody's eyes how the Gulf situation impacted, European security. And we are in the Mediterranean basin. So there is actually a sense that the Italian strategic destiny could be, in what we call the expanded Mediterranean. But then the question is, how far do you stretch this Mediterranean, right? Because then when you realize that you need to expand your vision of a Mediterranean, then you realize that there are some interconnectedness of security issues with Indo-Pacific. And this brings us to the update of our defense cooperation agreement with the Philippines. So will that necessarily lead to an RAA or a status of visited forces agreement like France? I don't know. And there are I can also honestly say that it is less likely than other states. But this doesn't mean that Italy does not have a footprint here and can give enhanced assistance, augmented assistance to the Philippines. And I see that there are many interactions between the Philippines armed forces and Italian armed forces, especially at the Navy level. So there are many activities being conducted, right? And they are important both for Italy for reasons of understanding, know-how, the situation, etc., and especially for the Philippines in terms of capability building that can be facilitated through an updated framework, right? So you can see, right, you guided me through these major European country strategies, and we see like a little bit of a division of labor emerging, perhaps unscripted or unconscious, right? So, yeah.
The last three countries have, I think, less vital roles, but in any way, let's maybe group them together. Netherlands, we signed an agreement to cooperate on shipbuilding. Mm-hmm. And then the Philippines also signed an agreement with Sweden to acquire, I think, defense equipment. And the third is the Czech Republic, where we just resumed the creation of a joint defense committee. Mm-hmm. So these are like smaller roles, but maybe you can just give us a broad take on these three countries?
Yeah, I must say, though, the Netherlands is also one of the first European states to articulate guidelines for Indo-Pacific and the EU integration in Indo-Pacific. So they actually played a significant role in orienting broader EU foreign policies to the Indo-Pacific. Now, of course, the Netherlands also is guided by similar values, interests as other countries, but of course they have limited capabilities compared to other nations. So we see, and I would like to lump, these. We see niche diplomacy being conducted there, just to, on the one hand, from the European side, have a footprint in the Philippines, and probably there's a lot of communication involved of what the Philippines actually needs and what these countries can actually provide. And we also see that there is this, let's say, division of labor is leading towards, from hard security, let's say, to more geoeconomic cooperation. Like, of course, in the case of the Netherlands, supporting the Philippine shipbuilding activities is not simply an economic initiative, because ports could be dual-use facilities, right? And in general, also, the idea of increasing maritime capacity of the Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands, like we always say, right? Has a direct impact on, for example, the challenge of sovereignty assertion that the Philippines has, or the challenge that the Philippines has to harness the potential of their internal waters. It's an area of basically resource exploration, etc., that has to be catered by infrastructure, for example, and ports are vital to that. Sweden has, of course, security interests, but for example, defense industry-related interests. But of course, they chose an approach that promotes confidence through a memorandum of understanding that facilitates trade in weapons, right, in a safe way, and facilitates, again, logistics, technical coordination among armed forces. And in a way, it's Sweden guaranteeing that what their defense companies are selling is actually a good product, because you can have a direct line of communication with the Swedish military on their issues, right? Or let's say better communication on that. So these frameworks are, and I think, I don't know much about the details of the Czech Republic initiative, but it is along those lines. I may also add, just to, because we're talking about European engagement, and I claim that Ukraine is part of Europe. And there is, let's say, an approachment between the Philippines and Ukraine, especially when it comes to the interest that the Philippines has in the production or joint production of drones. Right. Again, Ukraine has a lot on its plate. Of course, it's a state in extreme difficulty by many means. But this doesn't mean that even states with constrained possibilities can cooperate together in niche sectors that bring mutual benefits. So that's the logic, right? That's why also we're seeing diversification by both sides with, let's say, I don't want to sound derogatory, right? Less capable states, right? But they are capable in niches, and you compile one brick after the other, you have a very complex but nonetheless very relevant architecture here.
Interesting that you talked about niche diplomacy, that each country has, is fashioning its own niche in relation to the Philippines. So maybe just to conclude our interview, I think the final issue that we in the Philippines are looking at is Europe has more urgent concerns. I mean, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, which hopefully will end, but we don't know when. So how will this affect Europe's engagement with Indo-Pacific and the Philippines in particular?
Okay, look, yeah, it's a legitimate concern. And the tragedy here is power politics is here to stay. Superpowers will always pose challenges to other states that are, let's say, less capable, more constraints. And of course, Europe has a lot of its play in its plate. Like Europe intended as this overlapping of states, institutions, etc., that we mentioned earlier. But what I can say is that because of the return of power politics, because of the awareness of, unfortunately, more risky, more dangerous world, these states, sooner or later, or reluctantly or not, are allocating more resources in security policies. So I think the question will not be if they will be involved, but let's say, the intensity of this involvement, right? We are seeing that right now because, for example, France was meant to send a bigger number of troops for this year's Balikatan, leveraging the status of Visiting Forces Agreement, but they sent actually less because of their involvement, of course, or concerns in the Middle East. But this doesn't mean that France did not, right, send. So I think it will be graduated, it will be adjusted, it will be tailored, but the involvement will be sustained, of course. And also remember that many of these countries are, first, they're NATO countries. So there is, of course, there are long debates on whether to integrate Indo-Pacific key U.S. allies like Japan, Korea, Australia within a broader NATO framework. I'm not saying that. I don't want to go to that very institutional coordination. But the sense that, NATO or European security is embedded in Indo-Pacific security justifies these policies. So from, let's say, the receiving end of these engagement, the Philippines, there are legitimate doubts and concerns, of course, but I think there are many things in motion that will sustain a European involvement in Indo-Pacific and therefore Philippine security. And I would end with two elements. First, it also depends on the Philippines. And I think this is very important to emphasize because we can also see that a lot of engagements with like-minded partners started to happen during the time of Pinoy Aquino, after the Scarborough Shoal, during the arbitration, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing Canada, for example, being involved as well. But of course, for European states, because we have a certain idea of upkeeping certain values, like-mindedness is very important. And objectively speaking, all of these new, or let's say old new engagements happen when the current administration in the Philippines is more like-minded with European, let's say, ideas of what is an order, values, and so on and so on. And of course, during the Duterte administration, a lot of these engagements were suspended, halted, because of clear humanitarian concerns. So it depends on the Philippines in the sense that the Philippines has to manage these relations, right, and evaluate the extent and the consequences of the pursuit of certain policies or alignments versus the possibility of these states becoming less keen to sustain the Philippines. I would further complicate this in the sense that the security scenario of 10 years ago is different than the security scenario now. So I also suspect, or I also foresee European states becoming a bit more pragmatic into talking with administration that perhaps on the surface are less, let's say, aligned when it comes to these things. So let's see what happens. But I think when it comes to engagement, that's, goes hand in hand. And very last point is that, we touched it a little bit earlier, is that security in the 21st century, right, has many dimensions. So there is this whole new or old new issues of national security is the Philippines' economic security as well. Right? So the idea that you cannot really disembed totally your military alignments with your development trajectory and so on and so on. This is like a challenge for the Philippines, but it's also an opportunity because these countries are keen to friendshore their supply chains. And we were seeing, for example, Italy, Sweden, and Germany, and France, joining the Luzon Economic Corridor, which is a G7 initiative. It's an American initiative supported by the Japanese. But then these countries have an interest in supporting the Philippines infrastructurally, for example, or to have a footprint in embedding, right, having a stake in Philippine security that goes beyond military engagements. And so we can also see that this dimension will sustain, will be mutually influencing with the hard security or military security dimension as well.
Thank you, Matteo. That brings us, for the Filipinos, it's a big decision to make in the year 2028. Because as you said, a lot also depends on the Philippines and how it will proceed with its foreign policy. So thank you, Matteo, for your time. And thank you to the viewers as well. Before we go, we invite you to download Rappler's free app and join our chat channels to talk to us about this and other global and national issues. That's it for today's show. This has been Worldview with Marites Vitug. Till next time.